Are live. Welcome to the Free to Fly online conference and fashion show. I am your co-host, Patricia with a Y, Director of Operations of the freebirdprojectshop.com. And I am here with my co-host, Sasha, who is the Director of Finance for the freebirdprojectshop.com. And so here she is to introduce herself. Sasha.
Good morning, everybody. Sasha here. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, don't forget, I will be watching our Twitter feeds and our YouTube for any questions, comments, or feedback. So please hit me up.
And we are here with Nancie Vito, who is going to share her tips and techniques, 3 steps to getting out of being unstuck. And so she's going to start with a story of her personal story of burnout and move on to some things that we can do to get over that negative thinking that bogs us down. Nancie, thanks so much for joining us. And before we jump into your great topic, I'd love to learn a little bit more about you and what you do.
Absolutely. So, as you said, my name is Nancie Vito, and thank you so much for having me. This is already super fun. I'm super excited about this. And what I do is I am a life coach. That's my, that's my professional title. My background is actually in public health and mental health, and I transitioned to more of the coaching side in 2009. So basically, I'm focused on positive mental health, helping people move forward, helping people find fulfillment and happiness in their lives. And a huge focus for me as well is helping people who are burnt out, especially if they're burnt out in their jobs and they're just finding themselves either going through the motions or just finding themselves totally exhausted and drained from their work, that they don't seem to want to do much else, and it's overwhelming to take any steps. So
absolutely, and that is so important. So many of us deal with not being able to cope with the pressures of wanting to create an income, of trying to balance family life and other activities, and burnout is one of those things that is very easy to happen if you don't watch out for it.
it's so true. Yes, I agree completely. And sometimes it, if you don't recognize the red flags, because I've seen a lot of people just kind of be so in it and so in their work and in their routine of, going to work, coming home, vegging out, doing the same thing the next day kind of thing. And, they wake up one day and they're just exhausted, and their physical health sometimes is starting to be affected, and their relationships start to be affected. So sometimes it's good to recognize those early signs, because you're right, it can happen and all of a sudden you're in the middle of it.
Absolutely. So let's get to your story and how this became such a passion project for you.
Yes. So around 2004, I was actually working in a basement for an organization. And, there were times where I just felt really out of alignment with the work. Originally, I started the job because I felt like it was something that helped people, and I really, liked the underlying message. And as I got more and more into it, a year down the road and so forth, I just felt like I was working all hours, and this particular work environment was more about the numbers than the clients, if that makes sense. So it was kind of this underlying message of, I don't care about the clients and much less the employees' well-being. So it was really starting to get to me to where, I thought I came here because I wanted to help people, and there's so much focus on the other stuff, the paperwork, the documentation, the numbers piece, the hustle to get more clients. And, I just started feeling like it was not aligned with my values. That's really the main thing that I kept feeling. And I was also super sick all of the time. like my immune system was shot. So my body was also trying to tell me something. Of course, it probably didn't help that it was in a basement, but I kept getting all these sinus infections, random eye infections. It's like random stuff. My face was always really blotchy. I was just, someone described me at the time as sickly, which I've not ever been described as before. I just was always at the doctor's office for something, and it wasn't for prevention or wellness at the time. I was always sick. So I knew that something had to change. And then one day I actually left for lunch, which was odd because the culture there was that you don't leave for lunch. You stay and you work, and most people would eat at their desk and not take a break and that sort of thing. On my way back, I was sitting at a light. The light turned green, so I went to move forward, and a cement truck ran his red light and hit my car. And, and I was fine. But scary, of course, as you can imagine. And I sat there like, this is kind of the icing on the cake kind of thing, kind of the tipping point of where my life was at the moment. And looking back, there's so many other metaphors to the fact that it was a cement truck and I was feeling stuck. And then the fact that my car was totaled, so that it was also burnt out, and all these things that I look back on, I thought, oh gosh, it was just where my life was at the time. So I just realized something had to change because it was always just one thing after another. And I also got to a point where I realized that I had actually been creating a lot of my own stress and overwhelm. And that's really, eventually I quit my job. I actually hopped around for another few years, and I just ended up just diving into the whole personal development field. And, of course, my background was mental health. So then I started learning more and more about these coping techniques and more about the positive side of mental health. And once I got myself to a good place, I realized in 2009 that I was ready to help other people who were burnt out to do the same thing. And just that negative thinking pattern, when you're also in the middle of burnout, just doesn't help as well. So yeah, that's why I ended up starting my own business, which is called Flourish. So,
And that seems such an appropriate name. And it is, astounding in so many ways when you hear the stories. It's that you were literally hit by a cement truck in order to get your attention. And that's what it took. And sometimes that is what it takes. And hopefully the people that are listening in the audience are realizing they don't need to be hit by a cement truck in order to change things. A lot of times, that's one thing that I get from a lot of stories. It's like, okay, hitting rock bottom, getting hit by a cement truck. And it's like, okay, people, but we don't have to wait for rock bottom or the cement truck. The decision to change can happen at any time. We can make that decision ahead of that. But if we happen to be, as so many times we do end up being, just because that's human, sure, and there's no shame in it, it just happens when we do find ourselves, because it is, that slippery slope that takes us from being a strong woman to an abused woman. That same slippery slope takes us from being person to somebody suffering from burnout. It's always a slippery slope. And so a lot of times we don't realize what's happening until we're in it. And when we're in it, it's finding those tools and techniques to help us get out of it. So when we are in it, you've developed a 3-step strategy to getting out of it. So let's hear a little bit more about that.
Yes. Well, it's interesting, especially in this can work for anything, but if it's something where if someone is in the middle of what's called a stress response, so if you're in the middle of tears or something like that, this isn't appropriate for that. But for everyday kind of things, for if we're, starting to get stressed out at work or stressed out, kind of those daily stressors, really the first step, I call it the 3 R's. The first step is recognition, right? So I mean, with anything, we have to recognize the situation that we're in. And as you said, I mean, a lot of times we're not realizing that we're in the middle of it until something happens, or until we hit that rock bottom. So really, if you could start to recognize earlier on while you're kind of in that day-to-day, even if you're going through the motions. So it does take some reflection to see where you are in life and kind of if there's something that needs to change. And that's really kind of the first step, is recognition, which sounds very obvious. And yet when you actually do some reflection, there's so much that can come up to the surface. And, you know, I mean, like, there's so many things where you can say, you know what, this isn't where I want to be. You know, so it's just a matter of making that decision to do something about it. But to, you know, with anything, awareness is the first step, because we can't change anything without being aware of it. So that's the first step, was the recognition. And you can also use that as the recognition of thoughts. So when thoughts come up during the day of, I can't do this, I'm not good enough, I'm never going to make that deadline, that sort of thing, you can go on to the next step, which is the reframing of it. And this really is kind of a classic like cognitive theory, really. But reframing it is really, it can be life-changing. So, I mean, just thinking about something like, I'm never going to make this deadline. If you can reframe that and challenge your underlying assumption. So, for example, this one woman I worked with recently would get so stressed out at work, which is not uncommon, right? And sometimes we do work in very stressful environments and toxic environments. But when we become more and more aware of our thinking patterns and our underlying assumptions, we can start to challenge those, if, of course, we recognize them first. But if you think about, if you catch yourself thinking, I don't know if I'll make this deadline, there's too much work, and you ask yourself, what's another way of looking at this? And reframe it. So one thing that's really helpful is to reframe it, but with using like evidence, with using something that's more of a fact, which could be something like, you know what, I've always made my deadlines. I'm actually a really good worker. My colleagues respect my work, that sort of thing, which is what this one particular woman who I recently was working with ended up doing. And she said those techniques in itself were actually super helpful, just being at a stressful job, to recognize when those thoughts come up. And truly, when we have the thought that comes up, if we don't catch it, if we're not aware of it, that one thought can lead to another, which can lead to another, and that's when we spiral down. And then the thoughts become feelings. So even that one thought can become a whole range of feelings. The thought can become a feeling of anger or sadness or whatever, the whole range, the nervousness, a whole range of feelings. So if you can stop the thought before spiraling down into the feeling, that's often helpful. And again, to recognize the underlying assumption, which could be, the assumption there was, I'm not going to make the deadline. It's that sort of thing. It takes practice, and yet it's actually very doable. And just like I said, could be life-changing, especially if you're in a stressful situation. Another way you can do it too is use more of a mindfulness technique, which is basically become the observer of the thought. So you still recognize when the thought comes up and not engage with the thought, and then literally say, oh, there it is again. You can kind of watch it float away in a cloud, so you're not engaging with it. And you don't necessarily have to reframe it, but literally just kind of step back from it and, oh, there it is again, and kind of detach yourself from it, since we're not our thoughts, and you can kind of watch it float away. So, I mean, there's these little things that that can help throughout the day. And like I said, this is not something, if you're already feeling something, this isn't something for if you're grieving or if you're already in tears or something like that. But kind of the everyday, because I think it's the little smaller things that can add up and make us feel kind of this overall sense of well-being. Because, yeah, we definitely have to feel our feelings. If we're already there, you have to, if you're grieving over something, that sort of thing. But kind of those everyday things, it seems like if we don't catch those thoughts before we spiral, we're much better off oftentimes, because oftentimes we just create so many stories in our heads, and that can cause more stress and overwhelm. So yeah, so that was the recognition and the reframing. And the third step really is responsibility. I call it the 3 R's. And it can be hard to take steps forward. And truly, if you think about just one step to take, right? So oftentimes I'll work with people who want to make a big life change, or even something like moving to another state or something like that, or changing jobs or whatever it might be. And we often keep ourselves stuck because it's so overwhelming. And really, when you look at it and break it down, I mean, you don't even have to at first write out a whole plan, but if you think about just one thing that you can do and literally ask yourself, what's one thing that I can do right now to move forward with this? And then you take it one step at a time, and it can seem much less overwhelming. You can always put a plan together down the road, but you know, I've seen so many people just get unstuck just from asking themselves, what's one thing that I can do right now in this area? And that way you don't stay stagnant. You at least take a step forward, even if it's a baby steps. And then you continue to move forward with each step that feels right. So
absolutely. And that is very much like what we were talking about the other day with Trish, who was talking about speaking, but very much that same process of being aware and taking those little baby steps. That is so important in any process that you are trying to learn or get into something new. And I really liked the way that you described those negative thoughts as being separate from us, that we can let them float away in a bubble, and that can be a really effective way. And one of the things is that I was given recently is to look at those thoughts and think, well, that's an interesting thought.
yes.
And that can, what's the word? Destabilize that thought and go, you know, what do you mean I'm interesting?
Yes.
And
Yes. Absolutely.
and stuff like that. Yeah, and you have worked with a lot of women over the years. What do you find is the common denominator that really holds them back?
You know what? I have to say the thought patterns and the underlying belief systems, which is sometimes that I don't deserve this, or that women often think that they're being selfish if they're focusing on themselves, right? So oftentimes, I mean, I talk a lot about burnout from jobs, but oftentimes burnout can be from something else, you know, from being a mom, from being a caregiver, from being maybe in that sandwich generation where they're taking care of a child and an older parent. And oftentimes guilt comes up, which of course, you know, then the thoughts also come, and the negative tapes keep playing in our heads about, you know, I shouldn't focus on me right now because I have to help all these other people. And, you know, the truth is that when we fill our own cup up, right, you've heard I'm sure the mask metaphor, but I also like to look at the cup and think about, if there's an empty cup and you're not refilling it, you will at some point have nothing else to give, because the cup will be empty if you're not refilling it, right? So, you know, between the thoughts and the guilt and that sort of thing, and the feeling selfish, I know that's more than one thing, but I feel like they oftentimes tie together. And the truth is the better that we take care of ourselves, the better we can help other people.
And that is so much of a common message that we give ourselves and that we give each other too. If we do, and you know, it seems like we give mixed messages when it comes to that. We hear about a friend that's going to a spa or taking care of herself and going getting her nails done or her pedicure, and we're, oh, well, that's nice that you have the time and the money to do that, you know? And it is so, like, we do tend to pull each other down. It's like, instead of celebrating that our friend is taking the time and the energy and actually doing what we all talk about doing and that we all say we should be doing. And I'm not saying this happens with everybody. It's just something that I've noticed, especially within the Facebook community and so on. You get a friend that's like, oh, here I am. She's all excited. She's going and taking care of herself. And then you've got the negative Nellies that are coming on and say, oh, must be nice. So we do send mixed messages in that respect between each other. So maybe that's one thing that we could all commit to as free birds, is to supporting themselves instead of pulling them down, instead of being jealous and envious that they're doing what we tell each other to do. That we should stop looking at it as selfish and stop spreading the message that it is, because it's not. And if we want to look after ourselves, then we have to be looking after our sisters too.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And then recognizing, I mean, this all still ties in, because recognizing when you're saying, oh, lucky her, sometimes it's good to look at your own side of the street sometimes and think about, well, what's something I can do for myself right now, which it could be about creating boundaries. And making time for yourself, and really self-care doesn't have to cost money. You know, we do see people who are going out getting mani-pedis and massages and things like that. But even taking time out and downtime for yourself and doing something that you enjoy doing and remembering what those things are, it can be so beneficial, so beneficial.
Absolutely. And there are so many paths to self-care. It could be a beautiful cup of coffee, something that you enjoy. It could be a great poutine. I know that in Saskatoon right now, they're doing this whole poutine festival. That could be something that somebody's into that you can appreciate and take advantage of. There are so many things. It doesn't have to, a bath.
Yes.
Epsom salts, you know, and some sense. That can be a moment to yourself. It doesn't have to be complicated. And for anybody that is interested, I wrote a little freebie of 15 ways that you can calm yourself down when you're overwhelmed. And some of those things are so easy, like just taking a chance to pay attention to your breathing.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
That could work in a moment. And so when we're talking about self-care and self-love, it does not necessarily have to be, oh, I'm going to go for an afternoon. For some of that's way too much, especially if you have littles at home and you have to, sometimes when you have littles at home, it can be more stressful to try and figure out who's going to look after the kids, how am I going to get there, how am I going to pay for it, than it is to go and get that massage or whatever it is. So do within your, I mean, that's what it means about small steps, baby steps. It doesn't have to be going from not looking out after yourself at all to spending a weekend in a retreat. Take steps to that point.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, you're absolutely right. And based on your current situation, think about, you know, what are some things you can do. And there's also, yeah, I mean, there's different breathing techniques, or even just focusing back on your breathing, like you said. There's also a lot of apps out there that you can do, maybe even 5 or 10 minute guided meditations, that sort of thing. 5 or 10 minutes is definitely better than nothing. And sometimes, you know, if your schedule is crazy and you're running around, sometimes that is such a gift.
Absolutely. And I have found that that 5 minutes can really transform your day, because from that moment on, you're in that higher vibration, as my law of attraction friends would say, that you're in that higher vibration where, you know, you're feeling that, and everything that comes at you is gone through in that newer sense of feeling and knowing once you've done your little meditation. It doesn't take long to change how you're feeling about the day. And really, a lot of this is about changing those negative thoughts in your head, or at least in the beginning being aware of them, and